Hello everyone and welcome to another video. In 2012, an anonymous user on 4chan decided to share their journey in torturing their guests as much as possible in form of Mr. Bones' Wild Ride. It's an incredibly long car ride that goes past many graveyards and many incantations of the skeleton that is now dubbed Mr. Bones. And once they're done with the ride, the only place they can go is back into the queue line, leaving no way out. This became an incredibly famous meme and it popularized very long rides that are long purely for the sake of being long. But is it really that long? Sure, 70 minutes is a long time compared to your average ride in RollerCoaster Tycoon, but it's clear that you can build a much longer ride if you wish to. And after Mr. Bones' Wild Ride was released, many people have indeed done so. In fact, if you think about it, then it was probably never the longest ride to begin with. The game was already 10 years old when this was built, and in those 10 years it is very likely that at least one person has created a longer ride. It's of course impossible to know 100% for sure what the longest ride ever created is, as not everyone will share what they make online. The early years will be especially tricky and actually just outright impossible. But I have done my best and I have uncovered quite a few very old, very long rides to make a decent progression timeline of the longest ride ever built in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 and 2 that we know of. It is almost certainly incomplete, especially in the early years, but it is nonetheless very interesting. You can find links to posts, YouTube videos or downloads for every ride I discuss in this video in the description. Our starting point is March 22nd, 1999, the release date of the first RollerCoaster Tycoon game. It comes with a total of 21 scenarios that sometimes already have rides built in them, and there are also pre-built saved designs for various ride types available. The longest of these is the car ride from the crumbly woods scenario, Crazy Critters. With a ride duration of 6 minutes and 30 seconds, this is the longest ride that is included in the base game. Although actually it's not. Well, it is the longest, but it's not 6.5 minutes long, despite what the stats window says. Due to what is probably a programming mistake, both RCT1 and 2 report the ride duration as 25% longer than what it actually is. Therefore, this ride is actually 5 minutes and 12 seconds long. Luckily, this impacts all rides in the same way and we can still use the number that the game gives us to compare different rides. To keep it simple, I will use that number, but keep in mind that the actual ride duration is just 80% of that. And now what? How do we start tracking the record? Anyone may have created a longer ride than this as soon as the game was released, and someone somewhere will have done that. We have no choice but to just ignore that, as we cannot know it. There used to be a ride exchange on the old RollerCoasterTycoon.com website, but that site is long gone now. It does exist on the Wayback Machine, but there is a better way of accessing it today, as Gymnasiast has made an immense effort in archiving as many old RollerCoaster Tycoon websites as possible. You can access everything he's got on rctspace.com, and I extend a very big thank you to him, as archival work is incredibly important. The Ride Exchange has downloadable collections for steel coasters, car rides and corkscrew coasters, and it's the second one that we're interested in. The car ride collection contains this magnificent one called 5294, and with a ride length of 8 minutes and 48 seconds it is roughly a third longer than Crazy Critters. The track file of it was created on April 25th, 1999, just a month after the game's release. I am quite astonished that people were already sharing their designs online that quickly after the game's release. It shows that even back in 1999 the internet was already quite big and popular. In addition to the Ride Exchange, they also ran several different contests back in 1999 where you would have to build and decorate a certain ride type within a certain time frame. Most of these were for roller coasters, which don't tend to be that long, but one of them was for the go-karts. Between May 25th and June 8th, a whole number of go-kart tracks were submitted, and you can see the 7 ones that placed in the top 3 on the site. Not all of the downloads were able to be archived, but luckily the one for second place does work, and it looks like this. It is a multi-level go-kart that is nearly 3 kilometers long. Because of the higher speed of the go-karts, this is still a shorter ride time than the car ride we just saw, but Eric, who built this ride, is a genius and made it do 10 laps. This gives a massive total ride duration of 43 minutes and 8 seconds, easily beating the previous record. I don't know exactly when this was built, as the file that I have has the time of download as the creation date instead of the original date, but presumably it was within the duration of the contest. Therefore, I will write it down as June 8th, 1999, the final day of the contest. The expansions of RollerCoaster Tycoon 1, Corkscrew Follies and Loopy Landscapes do see a new longest pre-build, with 6 minutes and 54 seconds from the log flume in Alton Towers, but that pales in comparison to Eric's go-karts. Although, actually I found something that kind of proves that none of the rides we have discussed so far were ever the longest. There is an old webpage that shows some of the development of RollerCoaster Tycoon 1, including various stuff that didn't make it into the final game. I made an entire video on these pages a while ago, and one of the things that we talked about was this, a screenshot from July 1997, nearly 2 years before the game's release. At this point in time it looked a lot more wooden, which is charming but also not important right now. What is important is this: we can see a little bit of the stats window of one of the rides, and whatever ride that this is more than 59 minutes long. It is also a nice 69,000 and a bit feet long and seems to have an average speed of just 2.3 miles an hour. I don't know what on earth he built, but it is longer than any post-release ride that we have seen so far. I won't count it for the progression, as he definitely wasn't playing a normal version of the game, but I'm very glad that I happened to look at these old screenshots again and spotted this, because it is amazing. Anyway, a few years after Eric made his 43 minutes go-karts, on October 15th, 2002, RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 gets released. This has a whole bunch of new scenarios and many more pre-built saved designs, but none of them are long enough to break Eric's record. However, pretty soon after that, someone did create a longer ride. This is Humdick Go-Kart, a massive go-kart that spans nearly the entirety of a 254 by 254 plot, the maximum possible park size. It is so big that it takes the fastest guest a little over 6 hours to complete it. And that is just one lap. The creator of this ride could have set it to 10 laps for roughly a 60-hour ride time, but they didn't. I unfortunately have no idea who made this. I discovered that this ride exists when I put out a call for old long rides, and a user called Lurker amazingly came through by remembering that he had this save file on his computer. It is dated December 11th, 2002, which is roughly 2 months after RCT2 was released, but that's all he knows. He has no idea who made it or even where he's got it from, but we do know it's a very early, very long ride, and perhaps even the longest ever created at the time. Its 6 hours is also much longer than the 70 minutes of Mr. Bones, proving that it was indeed already surpassed more than 9 years earlier. 2003 saw the release of 2 expansion packs for RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, Wacky Worlds and Time Twister. Of course, none of the rides included in those were longer than 6 hours, but we did get a very long chairlift in Jurassic Safari. Just one side of this very slow 3 km/h chairlift takes 7 minutes and 20 seconds to complete, and if you add the 2 sides together you get a massive 14 minutes 17 seconds. However, this is not the longest officially released ride, as it had already been surpassed before it was released. On May 8th, 2003, a special version of RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 was released, RollerCoaster Tycoon Deluxe. This contains the base game plus both expansions, as well as a whole bunch of user-submitted pre-built saved designs. They are all named in the style of a U followed by 4 numbers in between parentheses, and a lot of them are very weird. One of them is this massive €312,000 Hyper Twister coaster, which is definitely the longest if you go by single lap distance, but since it's a roller coaster it goes quite fast and is done with it in just a few minutes. Another design is the nearly 10-minute car ride from the ride exchange that we saw before, so you can see where they got some of these from. For the longest rides we need to look at the go-karts. There's a whole bunch of quite long ones included, but most of them only do a single lap. Not all of them though, as U0143 is very long and it is one of the exceptions that does do the maximum of 10 laps. The ride time depends a bit depending on how fast the fastest kart of the race is and how much that kart gets stuck behind others, but I ran it a bunch of times and got ride durations between 44 and 50 minutes. This makes it a little bit longer than the go-karts from the contest that we saw earlier. It also makes it the longest officially released ride design in RollerCoaster Tycoon 1 and 2 combined, but since it was released after Humdig Go-Kart, it was never the longest ride ever built. During the editing of this video, I did discover an actual proper archive of the ride exchange that's also hosted on rctspace.com. Instead of just the 3 collections that were available on the page I showed earlier, this has over 3,000 rides. That's very cool, but it's not quite feasible for me to download them all and see if there's a very long ride in there. I did download a few with words like long or slow in the name, including one named the longest ride in the universe, and I checked those out, but none of them were even over 20 minutes long. Of course, long rides could have any name, so who knows what's in there, but we'll never know. That means that after the bit of action in 2002 and 2003, we will have to wait for a very long time for our next record. Well, maybe not, and maybe one of you knows of a ride that I don't know of, but in my investigation I found nothing longer than 6 hours in the next 12 years. We do eventually in 2012 get the great meme itself, Mr. Bones, but that's just a measly 70 minutes long. It is not until March 2015 that we see a new longer ride. YouTube user No One Will Watch This uploaded to YouTube the Wheel of Life and Death. It is a car ride that is as long as possible within the limits of the game. They just kept on building until the game literally would not allow them to place any more track. All we have to go on is this quite epic YouTube video, as no save file was provided, and in it we do not get to see the stats window. Not that it would have been accurate anyway, as this ride is much longer than the maximum ride duration that RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 can store and display. I do not really want to have to rebuild this entire ride, and luckily I don't have to. I happen to have a park-filling wild mouse coaster lying around, and with some cheats we can simply convert this into a car ride and we have ourselves a fake Wheel of Life and Death. Both rides use the maximum number of track pieces possible, so they also take the same time to complete. To test how long it is, we let our vintage car depart on March 1st, year 1, and see what the date is when it returns to the station. This happened to be on July 16th, year 60, meaning that it took a little over 59.5 in-game years for it to complete. A year in the game is just under 1 hour in real time, making the Wheel of Life and Death 54 hours long. And unlike with all the previous rides, this is the true ride time, not 25% more, as we are no longer using the ride duration reported by the game itself. From now on, we will always be using the method of timing it by looking at the number of in-game years it takes to complete and then converting that to real time. The wheel is about 9 times as long as Humdig Go-Kart, but the person who created this was not satisfied. Later in the same year, they released their next horrifying creation, Kairos the Slow. Instead of a car ride, this time they used a roller coaster. Usually those go quite fast, but on long straight sections their minimum speed is much slower than that of the car ride, leading to much longer ride times. This train will have to go all the way to the middle of the massive spiral, where it will fail to make the teensy tiny hill, and then it has to go all the way back to the station again. How long does Kairos take to complete? Well, this is where the story of the longest rides gets quite a bit messy, but I'll do my best to keep it as clear as possible. The creator claimed that it takes 210 real-life days to complete, which is much longer than the previous record of a little over 2 days. However, they do not provide a proper calculation method. All they say is that the train keeps slowing down forever but never stops, and that leads to a 210-day completion time. This is where I enter the picture. In 2017 I had just become active in the community and came across this ride. I was skeptical of the claim that it keeps slowing down forever, so I decided to test that, and I found out that it's not true. There is a certain minimum speed that the train can have, which is 1 km per hour. As soon as it reaches this speed, it will no longer slow down any further. After discovering this, I knew I had to test how long the ride actually takes, so I rebuilt it as once again no save file was provided. So I reconstructed the spiral, set it going and waited until it reached the middle, and then this happened. Instead of going backwards towards the station, the train eventually slows down so much that the speed underflows to the minimum forward speed again, leaving it stuck in the middle. So my conclusion was that this ride does not even work in the first place, and I did spread the word of that. The creator even noticed it, as they mentioned me showing this in the description of their video. But they weren't the only one who was wrong about their ride, as I too was mistaken. You see, by now a wonderful thing called OpenRCT2 had been created. This is an open source re-implementation of RollerCoaster Tycoon 2 that improves it in many ways, and I was using it to test the ride. One of the improvements of OpenRCT2 is the speed up function, and with it the train reaches the middle in less than an hour, making testing it rather simple. However, unbeknownst to me and the creator, as they were also using OpenRCT2, it contained a bug. In the original game, this speed underflow thing does not happen, and instead the train keeps on trucking backwards at a minimum speed 8 times slower than the minimum forward speed, eventually making it back to the station. When the train reaches the middle, it is the year 101, and it's only about 1/9 of the way done. The way back takes 8 times longer, and when it reaches the station again, the year 905 has just begun, which, if we convert it to real time, means that this ride takes 34 days to complete at normal speed. A far cry from the claimed 210 days, but still much longer than the 54 hours of the Wheel of Life and Death, so it's a new record nonetheless. A rollercoaster can do up to 7 laps, but from reading the original article about this, I am positive it was only set to 1 lap, so 34 days it is. I don't know exactly when Kairos was first published, as the original 8chan post doesn't seem to exist anymore, but the oldest reference I have found to it is a Tumblr post from November 20th, 2015, putting it about 8 months after the Wheel of Life and Death. Since in 2017 I had discovered that this ride does not work, or at least that's what I thought at the time, I took it upon myself to create the longest ride that I could think of to set a proper working record. Since I already had this spiral, I took that and extended it until the game would not let me build any further. Since I thought going backwards wouldn't work, I connected the end back to the station for a full circuit. I then also made it to the maximum of 20 laps to make it as long as possible. I called it the Spiral of Doom and calculated the ride length by measuring 1 lap and multiplying that by 20. It takes the ride almost exactly 204 in-game years to complete a single lap, which multiplied by 20 is 4080 years. Converting this to real time with a conversion factor of 6460, we get to a massive 154 real life days for this ride to complete. When I originally published this in February 2017, I still had a slightly wrong conversion factor and got to 152 days, but that's only a small difference. 154 days is shorter than the original claim for Kairos, but significantly longer than its actual duration. Except, I was also mistaken about my own creation. Yeah, I told you it was messy. You may have been confused when I first said that the maximum number of laps is 7 for rollercoasters, but that this one now does 20 of them? And you're right to be confused, as we are talking about different limits. I did not know this at the time, but OpenRCT2 had increased the maximum lap count from 7 to 20. The rules that I have lived by for the challenge of making the longest ride is that even though I will use OpenRCT2 to make it easier to build it and test it, it still has to theoretically be possible to create the ride in either RCT2 Vanilla or RCT Classic. I chose this because ultimately OpenRCT2 is unofficial and it could choose to change these limits at any time. And they indeed already have increased several relevant limits since I built my first longest ride, such as how many track pieces you can build on a single map. Therefore, I think it's best to keep to the limits and functionality of the original game, so that we have some official and unchanging rules. It is also much more interesting to build a new longest ride by using a different strategy than by just making it twice as big because some limits were increased. So, the 154 days number does not count, and recalculating it to 7 laps instead of 20 gives the Spiral of Doom a true ride duration of exactly 100 days less, with 54. Luckily this is still longer than Kairos, but by a factor of less than 2. I hope you now understand what I meant with the fact that it became quite messy at this point, and to make it all clear, here's a quick summary of it. In March 2015, YouTuber No One Will Watch This created the Wheel of Life and Death, a car ride that takes 54 hours to complete. In November of the same year they published Kairos, a corkscrew coaster that was claimed to take 210 days but actually only takes 34 days. When I discovered the falsehood of the 210-day claim, I published my own long coaster, the Spiral of Doom. In February 2017, I claimed that it takes 154 days to complete, but within the rules it comes no further than 54 days. The messy time is now mostly over, but the era of new incredibly long rides has only just begun. Just a month later, in March 2017, I came up with a new idea: block breaks. If you build a ride with block sections, only one train is allowed in each section at a time. You can exploit this by building a load of tiny block sections and one massive one like I did here. Watch what happens when I open it. The blue train departs and all the other trains can now move ahead one section, but then they have to wait as the blue train is still inside the very long first block section, which I marked with the black track. It's only when it passes the first block break that the second train can depart and the others can move ahead as well. But now we're in the same boat again and we're all waiting for train 2 to finish that big section, and then train 3, train 4 and so on. It's not until the final train departs that train 1, the blue train, can return to the station. The total ride duration is now the time it takes to traverse the black track multiplied by the amount of trains minus 1. If we take both of these things to their absolute maximum, we get this. It is a wild mouse track that is once again as long as possible, and it has 32 block sections, allowing for the maximum possible number of 31 trains. I switched from a corkscrew coaster to a wild mouse for 2 reasons. Firstly, the wild mouse has single car train, meaning we need less track for all those tiny block sections. And secondly, the tiny one-tile turns are more optimal than the small two-tile turns of the corkscrew coaster in terms of building the longest track possible. We do see the effect of this, because by the time the first car has travelled the entire first block section and the second train departs, it is the year 207, which means that one lap of this track takes 2 more in-game years than the previous ride. With 31 trains, we need to multiply this by 30 for the total ride time, which comes to a massive 234 real-life days. This is again a tiny bit longer than the 232 days I originally calculated, as I still had the wrong conversion factor between RCT time and real time. This is the only ride in the entire progression without a name, as apparently I just forgot. The previous one I named the Spiral of Doom, but this one is just called Spinning Wild Mouse 1. Creative. 234 days is a big improvement and it's nearing a full year, but we can still do so much better. It does take a while before I manage to conjure up the next iteration, but one day in December 2018 I am lying on my bed mindlessly playing a bit of guitar and suddenly the realization came over me. The answer is synchronization. That led me to this new setup, with one small wild mouse coaster that has the 31 trains on block breaks and one massive mini coaster. The idea is as follows: the wild mouse is only allowed to depart when the mini coaster can also depart, which means that the mini coaster now functions as the very long block section we had before. With just this setup, this is no different from the previous coaster, but what we can now do that we could not do before is increase the number of laps of the mini coaster to 7. This makes the time between departures on the wild mouse 7 times longer than before, resulting in a ride duration that is also 7 times as long. Here is a smaller version to make it easier to see in action. The mini coaster has to go around 7 times before the wild mouse can move forward 1 block break. And the actual ride works in the same way, with just a slightly longer mini coaster. Since for some reason this time I did not use a coaster type with tiny turns for the massive coaster, the duration of 1 lap is back down to 204 in-game years. We need to multiply this by 7 for the number of laps on the mini coaster and then by 30 for the amount of times a train has to depart on the wild mouse before the first one can get back to the station. This gets us to a total ride time of 4.4 real life years. The funny thing is that the ride that has that 4.4 year duration is not the massive park filling coaster, but rather the very small wild mouse with the 32 block sections. The big coaster is merely there to slow down the actual monster. The ride is called 12 Years of Suffering instead of 4, as when I built this I still had not realized my mistake of making it do 20 laps, which if you remember is the increased limit that Open RCT2 has, but is impossible in the original games. When I posted this coaster to YouTube, it went completely viral and very quickly got to over 1 million views, turning the challenge of the longest ride into a proper trend that certainly wasn't over yet. It took me half a year to come up with an idea to improve upon this. Although actually it's not a new idea, but rather the discovery that backwards moving vehicles were bugged in OpenRCT2. If you remember from Kairos, the 34-day long coaster, rollercoaster trains have a minimum backward speed that is 8 times slower than the minimum forward speed, but that was bugged in OpenRCT2 and backwards moving trains would eventually start moving forwards again, leading to them getting stuck. I discovered that this behavior was a bug in the summer of 2019 and it quickly got fixed by the OpenRCT2 developers. With this, we can now make 1 lap significantly longer. Instead of letting the train go back to the station at the very end of the lap, we now make it traverse the entire track backwards at 1/8 of the speed. This makes a single lap 9 times as long as before, vastly increasing the total ride time. Also, for some reason the coaster goes around one extra time if it returns to the station from the front in continuous circuit mode instead of from the back as usual. By this time I had realized my mistake of doing 20 laps, so it is now properly set to 7, but with that new behavior it actually does 8 laps, giving us another 14% extra ride time. There was one difficulty in making this work though, and that is going from one layer to another. In previous rides we did this with a chain lift, simple enough, but slow moving trains cannot pass over chain lift backwards, they would just be pushed forwards again. I tried a lot of different things, but nothing I tried allowed trains to change height and work in both directions. And we do have to change height, as the maximum amount of track pieces you can build is about 130,500, while the maximum park size only contains about 64,500 tiles. Only building one layer would reduce the ride time by more than 50%. And then it hit me. Boosters. These allow the train to move up the hill when going forwards and also move back down, as boosters do not work when the train goes backwards. The trouble is that boosters do not exist in RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. They did exist in RCT 1, but they got removed in the next game. However, RCT Classic, released for mobile in 2016, did add them back, so this design works in Classic, which is good enough for me. And even if you don't like using Classic, I just realized when working on this video that I could have just used the launched lift hill from the Twister coaster. You do need a chain lift piece to get the 1 km/h train up to the launched lift hill pieces, which means you need to make the hill taller in order to make it get enough speed to pass the chain lift when going back down, but with this setup it is possible to make it work in the original RollerCoaster Tycoon 2. Other than the backwards trains and one extra bonus lap, this setup works the exact same as before, but it is over 10 times as long as we go from 4.4 years to 45 years on the appropriately named coaster 45 Years in Hell. Because not only does it take half your life, you're also sitting still, making it incredibly boring and definitely someone's version of hell. There is one caveat to this setup, and also the previous one and all the ones after this. When one of the rides in a synchronized pair breaks down, the other one will ignore the synchronization to prevent getting stuck waiting forever. Since we are talking about rides that will take literal years to complete, it is pretty much guaranteed that the big base coaster will break down at some point, allowing the Wild Mouse to continue without waiting. This would technically invalidate all setups that use more than one ride, which is really boring. Therefore, we have been working with an unwritten rule of just disabling breakdowns entirely, for which there exists a simple cheat in OpenRCT2. Everything else will have to work in one of the original games for it to count though. It may seem a bit arbitrary to ignore that one thing, and I guess yeah it is, but by doing so we get much more interesting setups, and that makes it worth it in my opinion. It seems that with 45 Years in Hell we have now maxed out what we can do with just 2 rides. The big junior coaster is as long as it can be, with it maxing out the number of tile elements and going backwards, while the Wild Mouse has as many vehicles as possible with 31. If we do want to make it even longer, we will need to put something else in between there, another roller coaster that makes it even longer. Over the years I have gotten plenty of comments that say I should just synchronize multiple long roller coasters in a row, but that doesn't work. Sure, we can do that, but the problem is that they don't all wait for each other. If you make a chain like this, then at best you have multiple coasters doing the same job that one longer coaster did before. But in reality it will always be shorter, as the first ride in the chain already starts going again before the last ride in the chain has finished. Now, what we need is something extra in between the 2 rides that increases the amount of times the big coaster has to go around before the Wild Mouse can move forward one block section. In December 2019 I came up with this solution. 2 blue helper coasters that synchronize with the junior coaster and also with the block sectioned Wild Mouse, which now has 4 stations and is called the Century Coaster. To demonstrate how this works, we'll use a shorter orange junior coaster. Just note that for the real thing this coaster is again park-fillingly big. Some guests have just boarded the purple car at the only boarding station of the Century Coaster and they're ready to go, but they also need to wait for the car of the blue helper coasters as they are synchronized. At the same time, the junior coaster and the 2 helper coasters do depart. When the light blue coaster arrives next to the purple car, there is a problem, as the purple car cannot depart, there's still a car in the next block section. When this is the case with synchronized rides, when one of them is prevented from departing by block breaks, the other one will ignore synchronization and depart anyway. Shortly after, the same situation happens at the next station, and again it departs on its own. Then the other one, the dark blue helper coaster, arrives next to the Century Coaster, and this time the car on the Century Coaster is able to depart as the next station is empty. The car behind it is now also able to move forward, but after that the Century Coaster gets stuck again, as this car is now waiting for the first helper coaster to synchronize with, and that one has just gone by. The second one is now also finished and returns to its lower station, where both helper coasters have to wait until the junior coaster has finished. When that has finally happened, all three can go again, and this time the only car of the Century Coaster that moves ahead is the one in the second station, after which they again need to wait for the junior coaster to finish. The third time around, the purple car can finally move ahead one block section, and all the cars behind it can also move forward one step. And now the entire operation repeats. What this comes down to is that the setup of the helper coasters in between make it so that the Century Coaster can only move forward one step for every 3 times the junior coaster finishes its trip, instead of every time. Everything else is the same, so the total duration of the ride is also 3 times as long as the previous one. That one was 45 years long, so this one takes 135 years to complete, hence the name Century Coaster. In just a few years we have now gone from 6 hours to 135 years. In March 2015 we get the Wheel of Life and Death with 54 hours. In November of the same year we got Kairos with 34 days, and in February and March 2017 we got 54 and 234 days. Nearly 2 years later, in December 2018, we crossed the 1 year mark with 4.4 years. Half a year later that expanded to 45 years, and another half year later, just before the end of the decade, that tripled to 135 years. When recording footage for this bit, I discovered that in the main Century Coaster save file I left on the 10-second minimum waiting time on the extender coasters. That seems unimportant, but it throws off the timing, which causes it to only be a ×2 extension instead of a ×3. This technically makes the Century Coaster only 90 years long instead of 135, but I'm going to count it anyway, as with them disabled, as they're supposed to be, it does work correctly and is 135 years. I don't think it's possible to extend this even further with the same method, as 4 stations on one ride is the maximum possible. What we really need is a chain of rides that work exponentially. Say for every 2 times this red coaster goes around, the blue one goes around once, and then for every 2 times the blue coaster goes around, the yellow coaster goes once, and the same with yellow and green. That way, the red coaster would have to go around 8 times before the green one can go just once, and this doubles for every extra coaster in the chain. The question is it possible to do this? And if so, how? In OpenRCT2 I figured this out quite quickly, and this setup works for that. The catch is that OpenRCT2 is quite a bit more liberal with station synchronization, and what I made use of here is that in a situation like this, the purple station will wait for the orange station, while the orange station will not wait for the purple one. That does not work in the vanilla games, and there neither of these coasters would wait for each other, there's no synchronization at all. It only works in vanilla when both stations have their front tile right next to each other. Whatever I tried, I could not make it work, and that was the end of the saga of the longest ride, or so it seemed. Several years went by, but in early 2023 something happened. I finally decided to make work of a setup that was posted by user JJ in my Discord more than 2 years earlier in October 2020. At the time I had some issues with burnout and didn't want to do anything with it, but something triggered in me and I finally started working with this in January of 2023. What JJ had come up with is the exponential synchronization that we were looking for, and in a way that works in the vanilla games. Take a look at this example. Here there is a long purple coaster on one end, 3 wild mouse coasters in between, and a black coaster on the other end. If we speed this up a bit, you can clearly see that for every 2 times the purple coaster goes around, the orange wild mouse goes around fully only once. The same relation exists between the orange and the yellow wild mouse, and between the yellow and pink wild mouse. That means that for every 8 times the purple coaster goes around, the black coaster goes around just once, and that with only 3 extender coasters in between. This works by making use of the fact that 2 stations do not have to be at the exact same height in order to synchronize, they are also allowed to be 1 unit apart. With that, you can make this clever setup, where the wild mouse has 2 stations above each other that both synchronize with the purple looping coaster, but not with each other. When the wild mouse is in the top station, both it and the looping coaster are allowed to depart. It then moves on to the bottom station, where it again needs to wait for the looping coaster. When that comes around again, eventually, they both depart and the orange wild mouse can now go to the other side, where it encounters the 2 stacked stations of the yellow wild mouse. But this is now the exact same situation, with the orange wild mouse taking up the role of the looping coaster and the yellow wild mouse taking up the role of the orange one. That's again a ×2 multiplier, and that goes on forever for however many rides there are in the chain, and with this design they are really easy to chain. That leads us to this, which is the Universe Coaster. What you see here is one massive long looping coaster at the bottom, a ton of Wild Mouse extender coasters in between, including a few special orange ones that change the direction when the edge of the park is reached, and at the very end a black twister coaster with 31 trains, and that is the one that takes a very long time to complete. It all starts with the looping coaster, which is also a bit different than before. You may notice it's no longer 2 layers, but instead just a single one, and that's because with the new even slower method, going up or down is no longer possible. If you build a reverse incline coaster without a chain lift behind the station, then it never leaves the reversing mode and it cannot crash. When it then reaches the end of the track where it looks like it should crash, it will instead start reversing, but for some reason at a speed 4 times slower than the normal minimum backward speed. Yeah, even though it doesn't look like it, this train is moving, just very slowly. The track is only about half as long in terms of distance as before, but with a 4 times slower speed it still takes roughly twice as long to complete as before. This incredibly long looping coaster, which already takes over 2 real life years to complete all its 7 laps, is then connected to a chain of 253 Wild Mouse coasters, all of which take twice as long to complete as the previous one in the chain. Why 253? Because you cannot build more than 255 rides in a park, so after building the massive coaster and the final longest coaster you have 253 spots left for extender coasters. At the very end is the actual Universe Coaster, which again has 31 trains, multiplying the ride time by another factor of 30. Actually, it's even better, as with some clever synchronization setup similar to the one in the Century Coaster, all these trains can only move forward once for every 3 times the final Wild Mouse goes around. So, once you have departed on the Universe Coaster, you only get back once the final Wild Mouse has gone around 90 times. With 253 extenders you get the following ride time. 2.38 years for the massive coaster, times 2 to the power 253 times 90, which is 3.1 times 10 to the power 78 years, or 3.1 quinvigintillion if you want to be fancy. That is roughly as many years as there are atoms in the observable universe, hence the name of the ride. That is a fair bit longer than the previous record of 135 years, and it has now really exploded. We are no longer talking in plain numbers, but rather exponents, and every time the exponent increases by just 1, the ride length increases by a factor 10. With the exponential extension now figured out and done, is this the end? Can we go even longer? Well, we kind of already did a few years before the Universe Coaster, but also kind of not. Let me introduce you to the complicated world of mazes. What is the ride duration of this maze? Well, that depends, doesn't it? It depends on the guest behavior in a maze, and that is random. They could take the shortest possible path, but they might also be stuck in here forever. There is no upper bound on it. That makes mazes a difficult ride type to use for the longest ride. My idea of a very long ride is that you just have to open it and then it will do its thing reliably the same way every time without any further input. Sure, you could technically open a ride to let one train depart and get stuck and then close the ride and wait arbitrarily long to dispatch the second train that pushes the first train over the hill to complete the ride, but that's boring. Guests could also theoretically be stuck in a very small maze for longer than a Universe Coaster, but I don't think anyone would call that small maze a very long ride. What we can do though is use the average solving time. It may not be apples to apples with the long rides we've talked about so far, but it's still a lot of fun and very interesting. And people have been building massive soul-destroying mazes for a very long time, such as this beautiful example by New Element Design's user Old Red from 2005. It's very long, very pretty and very easy to get lost in, but we can do so much better. This is the Impossible Maze. Wait, what? Impossible? It's just a short out and back trip with a few indents on the way. What's so hard about that? Well, just take a look at how the guests try to solve it. They do not manage to get away from the entrance very far at all, and it's like they are attached to it with a rubber band or something. But if we swap the entrance and exit around, then suddenly it's a rather easy solve. What's going on here? The problem is with how the game does the randomness for which direction the guest should go in at the junction. For the full explanation and the code behind it, you should watch the video about it, but it comes to the fact that when the indents are on the left, the guest has a 75% chance to walk into it. And then when they come out of it, both left and right have a 50-50 chance. That means that for every indent a guest passes, there's a 37.5% chance that they walk into it and then start walking back in the direction they came from. In the impossible maze, the guest is now walking back to the entrance and now the indents are on the other side, the right side. Suddenly there's only a 25% chance they will go into it, leading to just a 12.5% chance of going back the other way at any given indent. So in a left indented maze they have a high chance of turning around when walking towards the exit and a low chance of turning around when walking back towards the entrance. This leaves them clustering around the entrance point of the maze with extremely little chance of ever making it out, as even when they're almost at the exit they could just turn around and walk all the way back to the entrance at any time. Even with a length of just 5 tiles it already takes the guests on average more than an hour to complete this maze. With 6 tiles that increases to nearly 7 hours, then 26, 107, 339 and a maze of length 10 is already so difficult that it takes guests more than 1,000 hours to complete it on average. With these numbers we can calculate the multiplier per indent, and I got a number for this that is extremely close to the square root of 2, meaning that for every indent guests take an average of 1.424 times longer to complete the maze. Now the question is, what's the biggest maze that we can make? Well, that's quite simple, just fill up the park entirely, which looks like this. That is an incredibly large maze with a total of 128,756 indents on the left. If we use the 26 hours and 29 minutes of the 7 tile long maze as the base, then the total length is then multiplied by 1.424 to the power 128,730. That is 6.6 times 10 to the power 19,758 years. That is an astonishingly large number with nearly 20,000 digits in it, although there is one catch here. This maze fills the entire park, which in the original games you cannot do as you cannot own the very outer ring. That is the downside of using OpenRCT2 all the time, sometimes you forget which features are new and which have always existed. I have since then gotten a lot better at knowing this, and I also do a lot of tests in the original games for things like this now. If we subtract that outer ring we lose 2024 of the 128,000 indent, reducing the average completion time by a factor of roughly 10 to the power 311. Yeah, just a small rounding error, it's just 311 zeros off, no biggie. This gives a final average completion time that is compliant with RCT2 Vanilla of 1.3 times 10 to the power 19,447 years, which according to the Conway Guy system is pronounced as 13 sexmilliquadrigen septuagin octillion. As amazingly incomprehensibly long as this time is, I do still feel weird of giving it the title of the longest ride ever created. While realistically it's never gonna happen before the end of the universe, a guest could, theoretically, not go into a single indent and walk straight to the exit in just a few hours. Well, maybe not, as all these calculations assume perfect randomness, while computers can usually only generate pseudo-random numbers, so perhaps guests even can't complete this maze at all. Despite the randomness disqualifying it from the official list, or at least the official list according to my rules, I did want to mention it because it does 100% belong in this video. Oh, and by the way, after I uploaded my video on the impossible maze, OpenRCT2 changed the algorithm so that guests no longer prefer one of the directions, so if you try this in the current version of OpenRCT2 then guests will have a much easier time solving it. The progression of this longest ride has been incredibly interesting. Even though we cannot be sure what the actual record was early on, we do know that people immediately started building very long rides just for the fun of it. I find Eric's 43-minute go-karts to be an excellent example of this. Even on the website it says that it ended up high specifically because it is so long and compact. Then we get Humdick Go-Kart very soon after the release of RollerCoaster Tycoon 2, which is just another example of people being curious what the limit is. After this we get the Wheel of Life and Death, which is the first ride to reach the map element limit, and in my opinion it is the first one that we can be relatively confident of at 54 hours that it was actually the longest ride ever built at the time. It is of course possible that someone went longer before that, but I think the chance is fairly low. After this we start using the very low minimum speed of roller coasters and the record skyrockets. From 34 days to very quickly already longer than a year and even longer than 100 years. Then, finally, more than 20 years after RollerCoaster Tycoon first released, we figured out exponentials and abused those to blow everything out of the water with the 10 to the power 78 years of the universe coaster. I built that thing about 3 years ago, and that record still stands as of writing this video. That leads us to the same question we asked earlier in this video. Is it even possible to make it even longer, or have we reached the end? Well, I can tell you that no, the end has not been reached yet, and a new, even longer ride is looming on the horizon. How long is it, and how does it work? Tune in next week to find out when I release the next iteration of the longest roller coaster and longest ride ever created. You definitely do not want to miss it, as compared to that one, the universe coaster is a tiny, short, entirely insignificant ride that is over in the blink of an eye. But that's all next week. If you're watching this video later, you can click here to see that new longest ride now. But in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this video about a bit of RollerCoaster Tycoon history. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next video.